Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the PHI Group.
Hello, everybody. Ron Peck, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the PHI Group, talking to you, well, not necessarily live. We are recording, but I'm alive as we record. Another episode of Empowering Plans with the PHI Group, and I can't tell you how happy I am to close my eyes and imagine that each and every one of you is standing in front of me and that I am actually communicating and interacting with another human being other than my 4-year-old son and wonderful wife. Speaking of human beings that I can do without, and I'm just kidding, of course, is Brady Bizarro. Brady, are you there? I know you're calling in via satellite from your bunker in parts unknown. How you doing, Brady?
I am here. I'm here at the C-SPAN headquarters. I'm doing well. How are you, Ron?
I'm doing great. Now, Brady, I happen to know that you are childless at this point, and therefore you are not forced to entertain a juvenile the way I am. However, I believe, are you violating the social distancing rules? Because I thought I heard Nick in the background. Is he there with you?
He's not with me. No, it seems that way.
Wait a second. Now,
yeah, hey there.
Nick, are you on the line, my friend?
I am on the line indeed. I am here, Ron. Good to hear your voice.
Oh,
you too,
man.
Brady.
So now, wait a second. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm a little old-fashioned and I'm confused, but I'm accustomed to being on a phone call and speaking one-on-one with another location or party. Now, you're telling me that we are somehow recording a podcast, each from a satellite location, more than 2 parties on the call at a given time?
I believe that's what's happening.
You nailed it. You nailed it.
Well, Brady Bizarro and Nicholas Bonds, attorneys with the PHI Group's consulting PGC department, welcome to the conference call. This is the new normal, guys. This is how we're going to be doing business. And, I think it's important, before we get into discussions of health benefits and healthcare and the types of issues people listen to this Empowering Plans podcast to learn about more, they also call in just to hear what's going on with the company, what we're working on, what we're dealing with, and what just hot topics in the news are impacting us, not necessarily as legal consultants and experts in health benefits, but as an employer, as a business. And the reason why I attempted to add some humor to the concept of this conference call platform is because one issue that recently popped up that, again, as someone who is both an employer and deals with other employers, recently was brought to our attention along with everybody else. And that is, as we, as employers, start to use this sort of virtual meeting and conference call technology with much more volume than in the past, really forced upon us by this pandemic, new security issues and questions of compliance start to pop up. And, things that maybe I thought I was saying in private to a group of 50 people dialing in for a staff meeting may actually be exposed. And of course, I'm being facetious there a little bit. But, Nick, this is something that kind of on the fly you were asked to research as these questions and concerns regarding, sort of these large group virtual meeting software platforms, conference calling platforms, video conferencing platforms are being used. What kind of compliance issues do employers, and particularly, I would say, the third-party administrators and plan administrators with whom we work, who obviously are dealing with a bunch of PHI, what kind of stuff should they be worrying about?
Well, Ron, you set it up pretty well for me there. We've all in this new normal been much more heavily reliant than we were previously on various platforms for video conferencing and having webinars and trying to keep up with everybody and keep in contact with all of our coworkers through virtual means. And a few of those platforms, I'm sure that our listeners have seen in recent news, exposed a few of their security flaws, which is a major concern for TPAs, for plan sponsors, for anyone operating in this healthcare space and dealing with protected health information. They obviously know that they have to be very careful to comply with the requirements of the HIPAA security and privacy rules. And if you're relying on a video conferencing platform that is compromised, you particularly need to take care to make sure that you're not inadvertently leaking any of that PHI that you have a duty to protect. We've seen a few different instances, people hacking into video conferences and either hijacking the video feeds or surreptitiously recording video feeds. Even last week, a few different security weaknesses have been demonstrated to be exploitable, allowing people to go in and actually download and copy video files that the user had thought were deleted, and it turns out that they were inadvertently saved to a cloud storage system. And so if you're using PHI, if you're mentioning PHI or putting PHI up on a screen and then sharing that screen with coworkers of yours, there's a serious potential that that information could be leaked and expose you to penalties under HIPAA.
Got to watch out for those leaks. Yeah. So, I guess at this point, it's really like a cost-benefit analysis, because in order to continue doing business and to operate, you need to tap into this software and use these programs. You can't basically say, well, it's not 100% secure, so I guess we can't do it.
Right. Absolutely. People have to use these services. These services are important to functioning in our modern self-quarantined business life. There are a lot of steps that plans and TPAs, anybody working on these platforms can take to try to ensure their privacy and to make it as difficult as possible for a leak like this to happen. Most of these platforms have options where you can apply passwords to the meeting so that not just anybody can log in without you being aware of them. They also have waiting rooms where a host can selectively choose who can actually enter the video conference room. But a few of them are implementing new security measures will let them do things like if somebody is causing a problem, or if they do get hijacked where somebody has infiltrated their call, they can actually report them to the operator of the platform so that those operators can collect data on these bad actors, these black hats that are going in and trying to do terrible things to people's screens. It lets them gather data on these people and report them to the authorities. There's also a few options where people with paid accounts, not necessarily people that are just free users, but paid accounts on some of these services, can actually selectively choose what regional routers their data is going through. So if you wanted to keep your information flowing through, say, a particular country or somewhere that you think may not be as secure, you can actually choose the route that your data takes once it's in the cloud. So there are a lot of other useful measures that people can implement. You can set up professional IDs that are randomly generated within the platform instead of using, say, like a personal meeting ID. And you can actually disable the ability of non-hosts to share their screens or to share files while you're using the platform. A lot of these types of steps will go a long way to making sure that you are, if not invulnerable to this type of hijacking, that you're at least not the low-hanging fruit, not the easiest person for some of these hackers and hijackers to pick up data from. So you can take reasonable steps to ensure the privacy and security of the PHI you're handling that way.
This is good stuff. This is good to know, and thank goodness, because Lord knows I couldn't go more than a couple of weeks without doing one of these incredible podcasts with you guys. And I don't want anybody to listen to these podcasts, and fortunately we've been able to avoid that so far. So we don't want anyone listening without my permission. No, I'm just kidding. The more the merrier. If anybody wants to hack this podcast and tune in, maybe they'll learn something. It'll be great. Speaking of learning and great, let's turn to Brady. So Brady, we just finished another FIA Group webinar. As always, it's a bit tricky to do those things live remotely instead of all sitting in a conference room and spitting all over the speakerphone like we normally do, which, these days I'm starting to look back on that and think maybe that was a mistake. But anyway, another informative, interesting webinar. I got to say, I was very happy about the topic that we selected, the fact that we were looking for that silver lining, that we were trying to be optimistic and cover, all the recent changes, whether we're talking about changes in law, changes in business, that innovations that are positively impacting our industry and hopefully at least paving a path so that when we get through this difficult time, there are opportunities on sort of the other side of the rainbow. And I don't know about you, but I don't think it's all doom and gloom, and I do think that the kind of opportunities we spoke about exist, and they're going to continue to grow. But for people who either tuned in and were unable to kind of listen in great detail, or were a little bit more interested about some of the topics that we briefly mentioned and went a bit of a deeper dive, I was hoping that we could maybe focus on some of the high points. Particularly, I know anytime we bring you on the podcast, Brady, you want to talk a little bit about sort of political and legislative news and movers and shakers there. And I wonder if maybe you want to talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the other sort of areas of positivity that we didn't give enough time during the webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the point of this webinar, I think we're all at the point where we could use some optimistic news. Nick just told us about how on top of the pandemic, we have to worry about people hacking our systems in the middle of this. And it's really just been a lot of, doom and gloom. And so I was glad that we were able to sort of try and brighten the mood, because there are some good things happening in the middle of all this. There's some things to look forward to, and we think it's important to periodically remind everyone of that in this process. So I think some of the things that we covered, quite a few positive things, but as you mentioned, Ron, I think the political response, and I kind of have transformed our political update to more of like a government response kind of analysis, because that's what matters right now is what is the government doing to shore up employers and, for our purposes, the healthcare industry, because we're taking a big hit. There's no way around it, right? We know that 22 million Americans lost their job. Many millions will lose their employer-sponsored coverage. You've got a lot of small businesses that have closed their doors, and many more might. We just had one of the things I think is important to remind people of is the Senate has just passed, and it'll soon be getting signed into law, a replenishment of what's known as the Paycheck Protection Program. That's some really good news, I think, for a lot of our clients and for the industry. So remember that according to the New York Times, the average self-funded plan covers between 300 and 400 employees. So that's pretty much what we designate as a small business. And for Congress's purposes, that number qualifies as well. So you as an employer who has fewer than 500 employees will, generally speaking, be able to get assistance from the government in the form of a forgivable loan under this program that they've established for small businesses. So that's really good news that they're adding $340 billion, I think, dollars to this program. The program came out a couple of weeks ago, and the money was gone very quickly. By allowing small employers access to this money, it'll really keep a lot of them alive. And that's true for a lot of employers, a lot of groups that otherwise might have gone belly up will now have access to a lot more money to keep them afloat. So that's really good news on one end. The other thing I think we talked about, and Jen covered this a bit on the testing front, but that's really the key to getting things reopened. We have a roadmap to reopening the economy, which I think is, to some maybe it's shocking, but it's really what we're going to need to see to get things restarted. And the key to unlocking the economy is going to be through testing. So we talked about how there's a lot newer designs of tests coming out. There's one you can take at home coming soon. We have one that you can get results in 5 minutes. We know that self-funded plans have to cover the cost of all FDA-approved tests. But I think that as testing ability expands and we see some positive news coming with some of these antibody tests, that's going to show us sort of the road to recovery for the economy and for small employers and therefore for the self-funded industry as a whole. So those are two things I think are really important to know. And then, we can't go a podcast without discussing a little bit about what's happening with 2020. And we cover this as well too, but Medicare for All took a pretty big hit in the last few weeks with its main proponent dropping out in the form of Senator Sanders. So I think that's good news as well, in the sense that, at least for now, with Congress is acting in a way I think that is going to strengthen and bolster employer insurance and really crowd out the calls from the Medicare for All crowd as being a little too extreme right now and not good timing. So those are the things that I thought and I took away as positive signs for the industry going forward.
I like that you're bringing up, different elements of what's going on in the industry and the fact that, A, benefits, B, government aid. One of the things that has come up more than once, and you mentioned the Medicare for All, and the fact that from the political presidential campaign, sort of the biggest proponents Elizabeth Warren and, of course, Bernie are no longer in the running, that, we can back a little bit from that. But what's interesting is, as we talk about benefits, what's covered, what isn't, what these new rules and laws require these plans to cover, a lot of people kind of say, well, it's sort of a moot point because so many people are losing their jobs. And if you lose your job, it doesn't really matter what your employer's plan covers or doesn't cover because you're no longer part of that plan. And what I think is important, and maybe it's something that as a self-funded industry, we've not done enough to talk about, is the fact that, if you're an employer and you're self-funding your benefits, right off the bat, hopefully you're doing the things that we talk about on a regular basis to contain costs. And if you're doing a good job of containing costs, maybe that means, hopefully, that results in maybe fewer layoffs or fewer furloughs because you're saving money elsewhere. But let's say hypothetically that's not the case, and you still have to let people go. Hopefully, by making your plan more affordable, that's going to trickle down into the COBRA, right? And if someone has to pick up the entire cost of their contribution under COBRA, that contribution is hopefully lower than, let's say, if you were in a traditional fully insured plan, right? Because that premium, the kind of cost containment measures that we put into place with the self-funded plan aren't there for the fully insured. So that's another area that I think self-funding, even if we're talking about people losing their jobs, plays a role. And then lastly, a lot of these self-funded administrators, and Nick, you're on the line, and Brady, in PGC, in our consulting division, we're often asked to help revise, plan documents, the language to support what the employer, the plan administrator, wants to do with their plan. We saw an influx in the name of these employers and these administrators who wanted to expand eligibility. They wanted to cover the employees who were being put on furlough, and they wanted to provide language in their plan document that would make it so. So that's something that a self-funded employer is looking to do that maybe the traditional fully funded insurance carriers were a little bit slower to react. So, again, in that, it's amazing to try and find some silver lining, positivity when we're talking about people losing their jobs. But ultimately, if you think about it, even these self-funded employers, when they have employees who are losing their jobs, are doing what they can to make it as bearable as possible on the one hand. And I truly believe that when the economy turns around and there's a scramble to hire these people, those employers who have robust self-funded benefit plans are going to have an advantage. They're going to have a leg up on the competition when it comes to retaining talent. Only time will tell, but I think, again, these are reasons for optimism.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ron, to your point, I think this is why it's so important to have an effective government response, because this is, we pretty much induced this economic freeze that we're in, right? This is not something that happened naturally. So a lot of employers, a lot of small businesses who are self-funded, they don't want to get rid of these workers. They want to keep their workers. So that's why we keep getting questions about, hey, how do we keep them on, throughout the 2 or 3 months that are coming up that'll be painful. We want to keep them on the plan because we're going to return them to the workforce. So I think that's going to be, like you said, it'll make the self-funded industry look very good compared to other employers who perhaps are just letting their employees sort of go and not continue their coverage. It'll be much easier to restart once things get moving again. But you need to have that government assistance. And that's why I'm glad to see that they've refunded this program meant to help small businesses, and it'll help a lot of our clients and those in the industry as well.
So at this point, guys, there's so many good things to talk about and so many positive things. I mean, Brady, what else do you have to help cheer me up?
Oh, boy. I think we talked about one of the slides in the webinar. We had sort of an overarching slide about all the things to be positive. One thing that wasn't on there that I wanted to put on that slide was how the environment's doing so well. And I know Nick and I talked about this offline. You're starting to see animals return to cities, and like the waters in Venice are clear. I mean, that's a good thing, right, Ron?
There are coyotes in my backyard. I don't know if I would file that under good news, Brady.
There's that town in Wales that's been taken over by goats, right?
Well, I mean, I heard goat milk and goat cheese is a little bit easier to digest if you're lactose intolerant. But other than that, no, it is interesting because I think that it's a harsh lesson, but I think that this does serve as a good, I don't want to call it a test, but I guess that's really what it is, an examination or a test of us as an industry, as employers, right? One, were we able to adjust quickly to this quarantined work from home environment that we find ourselves in? Which businesses were able to adjust quickly and which weren't? And I must say that we were very fortunate in the fact that because we're in New England, because we deal with such inclement weather on such a random basis, right? One day it could be 60 degrees, the next there's a nor'easter, 12 inches of snow. We invested early on in the capability to work from home, right? And even though I don't think we were ever planning on doing it for such an extended period of time, we at least had that technological infrastructure to do that. And a lot of employers maybe didn't. And so this was ultimately a major test of that capability, and I'm very happy to say that we've passed that test. Additionally, as we constantly as an industry are telling the media, we're telling employers, we're telling lawmakers both at the state and national level that self-funded employers care about their employees, that self-funded employers are better able to contain costs. But it's just talk until the rubber hits the road. And I think, as we've already mentioned during this podcast, that the number of self-funded employers who reached out and said, how do I continue benefits for furloughed employees? How do I extend eligibility? How do I make my plan more affordable for people to afford on COBRA? Those questions that came in and the fact that they've actually accomplished that are proof positive in the face of this test that self-funded plans are more resilient and able to handle something like this. So, just like Mother Nature or anything else, I think it's an extreme test of our ability. But thus far, I like what I've seen.
Amen.
So, guys, I appreciate the time. I know everybody has a lot to do. I am so grateful to everyone who, the two of you who have dialed in, those on the team who have contributed to this information, and of course to our listeners. Hopefully, hearing our voices, talking, about the business instead of, hey, do we have enough toilet paper to make it through the week, is going to at least give you a bit of a break. But as with all good things, this too must come to an end, and it's time to get back to stockpiling cans of soup and watching Netflix. So on behalf of myself, the entirety of the FIA group, the industry, stay well, stay strong, and continue to do good things and fight the good fight. Thank you for listening to Empowering Plans podcast with the FIA group.